It was a quiet night on the small, peaceful planet of Zorith. The stars shone brightly in the sky, and the soft winds rustled through the trees. It was a place where nothing ever seemed to go wrong, a world untouched by the chaos of the galaxy. But tonight, something was different. Something was wrong. Commander Lyra sat in her small control room, staring out the window at the endless sky. She was tired, having just finished a long day of routine checks on the base. Everything had been normal, too normal. There had been no new threats, no urgent messages, nothing unusual. It was the kind of night she preferred, where things were quiet and safe. But as she sipped her drink and gazed out at the stars, something caught her attention. A strange feeling stirred in the pit of her stomach, a feeling that made her look toward the communication panel in the corner of the room. The flickering light from the monitor reflected off her tired face as she stood up slowly, moving toward it. The base was quiet, too quiet. The usual hum of machinery and the voices of her crew were absent. The silence felt unnatural, like the calm before a storm. Lyra sat down at the communication console and pressed a few buttons to check the frequency. No messages, no reports, no incoming transmissions. Everything was dead. She glanced at the time. It was well past midnight. Maybe everyone was asleep, but she still couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was no real reason to be worried. The planet was peaceful, surrounded by a vast, empty space. There were no known threats in the area. And yet, she couldn't shake the unease that had settled over her. Just as she was about to dismiss the thought, it came. A sound. A strange, soft sound that seemed to come from deep within the walls of the base. It was so faint at first that Lyra thought she might have imagined it. But then it came again. A low, echoing thud that made the floor vibrate slightly beneath her feet. It was like a distant rumble, but with an unsettling, unnatural quality to it. Lyra's heart skipped a beat. She stood up quickly, her mind racing. What was that sound? Could it be a malfunction? Maybe something was wrong with the power generators. But no. If it were a malfunction, the base's alarms would have gone off. She grabbed a flashlight and moved toward the nearest hallway, her footsteps echoing loudly in the stillness. The sound had come from somewhere deep within the lower levels of the base. She headed toward the elevator, her hand tightly gripping the flashlight. Every step she took felt heavier, as if the air itself had become thick with tension. The elevator doors slid open with a soft hiss, and she stepped inside, pressing the button for the lower levels. The elevator descended slowly, the lights flickering slightly as it went deeper into the heart of the base. The further it went, the more oppressive the silence became. The hum of the machinery was absent, and the only sound that filled the air was the rhythmic motion of the elevator as it descended. When the doors finally opened, Lyra stepped out into the dark corridor. The lights flickered weakly, casting long, eerie shadows against the walls. The air smelled musty, and the floor was cold beneath her boots. She raised her flashlight, shining the beam down the hallway, but there was nothing. No signs of life. No movement. Nothing out of place. Then, there it was again. A low, rumbling sound echoed through the walls. It was louder this time, closer. Lyra's pulse quickened, her instincts telling her something was wrong. She slowly moved down the corridor, her flashlight scanning every corner, every door. The sound was growing louder now, almost deafening. She turned a corner and froze. At the end of the hallway was a door, one that she knew should have been locked. It was the entrance to a restricted area of the base, a place where only high-ranking officers were allowed to go. But the door was wide open, the metal frame creaking with the sound of something moving inside. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. She had no idea how the door had opened, but she knew she had to check. Slowly, she moved toward the door, her hand gripping the flashlight tightly. She could hear the sound more clearly now, like something, or someone, was moving inside. She pushed the door open, the creaking sound echoing through the hall. Inside was a large, dark room filled with strange machinery. The low, rumbling sound was coming from somewhere in the center of the room. Lyra stepped forward, shining her flashlight on the machines. They were all powered down, their lights dim and lifeless. Yet the sound continued, vibrating through the walls. And then she saw it. In the center of the room was a small, strange device. It was unlike anything she had ever seen before, an object made of dark metal, with strange symbols carved into its surface. It was glowing faintly, pulsating with an eerie light. The rumbling sound seemed to be coming from inside the device, as if it was alive. Lyra felt a chill run down her spine. She took a step back, unsure of what she was seeing. This wasn't part of any equipment she knew about. This wasn't standard military technology. The device felt alien. The rumbling grew louder, and Lyra's heart raced. She couldn't explain it, but she felt a deep, growing sense of dread. This was no accident. This sound, this object, it was something far beyond her understanding, something she wasn't meant to find. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered, then went out entirely, plunging the room into complete darkness. The rumbling stopped. A voice, low and distorted, sounded through the silence. "You shouldn't have come here." Lyra froze, her blood turning to ice. The voice was not human. It was something else, something far older and far more dangerous. And then the device flared to life, filling the room with a blinding light. Lyra stood frozen in the pitch-black room, her heart hammering in her chest. The strange voice echoed in her ears, a chilling whisper that sent shivers down her spine. "You shouldn't have come here." The words were clear, but their source was impossible to pinpoint. It wasn't coming from any speaker in the room. It was as if the very walls themselves had spoken. The silence that followed was suffocating. Lyra's flashlight had fallen to the ground, its beam now a faint flicker on the floor. The pulsing glow from the device at the center of the room was the only light, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Her hands trembled as she tried to steady her breath, her mind racing. What was this place? What was that voice? And most importantly, what had she stumbled upon? Her eyes darted around the room, trying to find any sign of movement, any clue as to what was happening. The hum from the mysterious device had grown louder, almost vibrating through her very bones. It was as though the object was alive, its energy filling the room, making the air itself seem thick and oppressive. Suddenly, a loud click echoed through the room, followed by a low mechanical whirring sound. The dim lights above flickered back on, casting an unnatural yellow glow over the room. Lyra squinted, trying to make sense of what was happening. The machine before her, if it could even be called a machine, had shifted. Panels on its surface had opened, revealing strange, glowing symbols inside. The symbols flickered like living things, almost as though they were trying to communicate. Lyra swallowed hard, her instincts screaming at her to run, to get away from whatever this was. But her feet felt like they were glued to the floor. She had to understand. She had to know what was going on. Her eyes locked onto the object in the center of the room. The pulsing glow was now a steady rhythm, like a heartbeat, calm, but foreboding. Without thinking, Lyra stepped closer. The closer she got, the more intense the feeling in her chest became, like the room itself was drawing her in. As she reached out to touch the device, the lights above flickered once more, and the air in the room seemed to grow colder. The hum intensified, vibrating through the floor beneath her boots. Lyra's hand hovered just above the surface of the device, her fingers brushing against the cool metal. Then, without warning, the object responded. A sudden burst of energy shot out from the device, a shockwave of heat and light that pushed Lyra back, throwing her against the wall with a heavy crash. Pain shot through her body as her head slammed against the metal, but she forced herself to stay conscious. She could feel a vibration in her bones as the object in the center of the room began to spin, its panels opening wider and wider. The symbols glowed brighter, flashing faster, like a message trying to be understood. "Who are you?" Lyra managed to whisper, her voice hoarse from the impact. What is this? Her voice seemed to break the strange hold the device had on the room, and the pulsing light suddenly stopped. The device fell silent, its glow dimming until it was nothing more than a faint pulse. But before Lyra could react, the same voice, the voice she had heard earlier, whispered once again, "You were never meant to find us." Lyra's heart skipped a beat. She pushed herself up from the floor, her body still sore from the fall. The words echoed in her mind, their meaning haunting her. Who was us? And what had she uncovered? The ground beneath her feet began to rumble, and the lights in the room flickered violently. She barely had time to react before the entire structure around her seemed to groan, as if it were alive. The walls shook, and a deep guttural noise came from deep within the base, like something ancient had awoken. The room's air felt heavy, filled with an energy that made the hairs on Lyra's neck stand on end. She reached for the door, but it slammed shut with a force that nearly knocked her off her feet. The room was sealed. Trapped. Lyra felt a rising panic clawing at her chest. This wasn't just some piece of old technology. This was something far more dangerous. The object, the device, had to be part of something bigger, something that had been hidden away for a reason she was now uncovering, but at what cost? She turned back toward the center of the room, where the device now seemed to be vibrating with power. The symbols on it were no longer just glowing. They were shifting, changing, twisting in ways that defied logic. Something was happening, something terrifying. And then, with a sudden, violent crash, the floor beneath her feet cracked open, sending a shockwave of force that nearly knocked her down. Lyra stumbled, her breath coming in short gasps as the ground opened up beneath her. A dark, shadowy figure began to rise from the depths, emerging from the broken floor like a serpent rising from the darkness. It was not human. Its shape was alien, indescribable, but its presence filled the room with a sense of dread that Lyra couldn't escape. The figure's eyes, glowing a sickly green, locked onto hers, and Lyra felt her blood run cold. The voice, the same voice, spoke again, but this time it was louder, more powerful. "You have unleashed us," the voice growled, "and now you will face the consequences." Lyra's mind raced, but her body was frozen. She had to get out. She had to warn her crew. But as she turned to run, the doors slammed shut with an unnatural force, trapping her inside with the creature. Her pulse raced, her mind reeling. What had she uncovered? What was this creature? And why had it been hidden away for so long? Lyra knew that the answers would come at a great cost, but she also knew one thing for sure: the galaxy would never be the same again. The unexpected sound had opened a door to something far darker than she could have ever imagined. Now it was up to her to survive and face the terrifying truth. The shadowy figure that had emerged from the ground loomed over Lyra, its twisted form pulsating with an unnatural energy. Its eyes, glowing with a sinister green hue, pierced through the dim light, as if it were peering directly into her soul. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. Her mind was racing, trying to process everything that had just happened. The rumbling sound, the mysterious voice, and now this creature. She had no idea what it was, but she knew one thing for certain: it was not friendly. It seemed to be made of pure darkness, a swirling mass of energy that defied all logic. The air around it was thick with a cold, oppressive force, as if the creature itself sucked the warmth from the room. The walls around her groaned, the base's structure visibly shaking from the power it radiated. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, trying to put distance between herself and the creature. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like lead. Every instinct told her to flee, but the doors were locked, and the room had become a prison. She was trapped. The creature's voice, no longer a whisper but a guttural growl, filled the room, vibrating through her very bones. "You should not have come here, human," it said, its voice echoing off the walls. "This place is not meant for your kind. You have awakened forces far beyond your understanding." Lyra's eyes darted around the room, desperately searching for any way out, but there was nothing. The walls were solid, the door sealed shut. She had no choice but to confront whatever this thing was. The thought of facing it head-on terrified her, but the alternative was even worse, staying trapped in this room, waiting for whatever was coming next. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling, but she forced herself to sound confident. "Why are you here? What is this place?" The creature tilted its head, as if considering her words. Its dark form seemed to writhe and shift, the air around it rippling with unnatural energy. Lyra's grip tightened on her flashlight, though she knew it was no use. Whatever this thing was, it was beyond anything her weapons could handle. "This is not your fight, human," the creature replied, its voice growing colder, more menacing. "This place, this base, it was never meant for you. It was meant to be a prison for something far more dangerous than you could ever imagine." A cold chill swept through the room as the creature's words sank in. A prison. What was it talking about? What was locked away in this place that was so dangerous? Lyra's mind raced as she tried to make sense of the situation. She knew one thing for sure. This creature was not alone. There was something far worse lurking in the shadows, something that had been locked away for a reason. And now it had been set free. "Prison," Lyra echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you talking about? What is locked here?" The creature's green eyes glowed brighter, its gaze fixed on her with a deep, unsettling intensity. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the creature spoke again, its voice low and ominous. "Long ago, there was a war," it began. "A war between us, the Deathworlders, and those who dared to imprison us. We were trapped, bound to this place by those who feared us. We were kept here, sealed away. Until now." Lyra's blood ran cold. Deathworlders. She had heard stories, rumors about terrifying creatures that came from planets filled with danger, worlds where life fought for survival against unimaginable odds. But this was something far worse. The creature's form seemed to shift again, and Lyra could feel the temperature drop. The walls shook, and a low rumble filled the air, as if the very foundation of the base was beginning to crack under the strain of whatever was happening. "You have no idea what you've unleashed," the creature continued, its voice now tinged with malice. "You've broken the seal, and now the galaxy will pay the price." Suddenly, there was a loud explosion from deep within the base. The entire room trembled as the ground beneath her feet cracked open, and a deep, resounding roar echoed through the structure. It sounded like something large, something monstrous, was awakening. Lyra's heart raced as the realization hit her. Whatever was locked away here, it was waking up, and she had just set it free. The creature before her smiled, a cruel, wicked grin that sent a jolt of fear through Lyra's chest. "Your people will learn," it hissed. "The galaxy will learn. The Deathworlders are coming." As the creature's words echoed in her mind, Lyra knew that she had to escape. She had to warn her crew, warn the galaxy. Whatever was happening here, whatever ancient evil had been unleashed, it was just the beginning. The galaxy was about to be thrown into chaos. But before she could even move, the room was flooded with an eerie green light. The creature's form twisted and merged with the darkness around it, becoming a part of the very walls. The glow intensified, filling the room with blinding light. Lyra shielded her eyes, but it was too late. The ground beneath her feet cracked open again, and before she could react, a powerful force shot through the room, sending her sprawling to the floor. Her body hit the ground hard, and she struggled to stay conscious. The last thing she saw before the world went black was the creature's glowing eyes, watching her with a look of triumph. "You will never escape," the voice echoed, as if coming from all around her. "You are already a part of the past." Then, darkness. Lyra awoke some time later, her body aching from the impact. Her head throbbed, and her vision was blurred. She blinked a few times, trying to focus. The room was silent now, the glow from the creature gone. It was as if everything had returned to normal. But she knew it hadn't. The terror was still there, lurking beneath the surface. She pushed herself to her feet, trying to steady herself. The room was still sealed. The mysterious device, the creature, the prison. It all felt like a nightmare, but it was real. And she had to find a way to stop whatever had been set loose. With trembling hands, Lyra pressed a button on the wall, activating the emergency override. The door slid open slowly, and she stepped out into the darkened hallway. She didn't know where to go, what to do, or even if she could stop what had already begun. But she knew one thing for sure. The galaxy was on the brink of something far worse than war. And she was the only one who knew it. Lyra staggered into the dark hallway, her mind swirling with confusion, fear, and uncertainty. The blinding green light had faded, leaving nothing but the cold, empty silence of the base. Her heart was still racing. But now, every step she took felt like it echoed through the walls, each footfall a reminder of the terrifying events that had unfolded. Her hands were shaking as she fumbled for her communicator. She needed to contact the crew, warn them about what was happening. She needed to get off this forsaken planet. But when she pulled up the comms panel, she was met with nothing. Static, a deep, unyielding silence. "Come on," she muttered under her breath, her frustration growing. She tapped the screen again and again, hoping for some sign of life, but the device remained useless. Her mind raced. If the comms were down, the entire base was compromised. Whatever had caused the base to shake, the walls to rumble, had likely disabled all communication systems. The panic began to settle in, but she fought it back. She couldn't afford to lose control now. She had to find a way out. With grim determination, Lyra turned away from the comms station and moved further down the hallway. The lights flickered above her, casting long, eerie shadows that danced along the walls. The silence was oppressive, suffocating. Every step she took felt like she was being watched, though she saw no one. The base had once felt like a place of order and security, but now it felt alive with an eerie malevolence. She needed to figure out what had happened to the others, if they were even still alive. Had the Deathworlders already reached them? Had the creature awakened more of them? Her mind ran through all the possibilities, none of them good. Then she heard it. The faintest sound, barely audible above the hum of the emergency lights. It was soft at first, almost like a whisper, but then it grew louder, more distinct. A low, guttural growl. Lyra froze. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end as the sound echoed through the hall, growing louder and more menacing. It was coming from behind her, deeper within the base, down the corridor that she had just passed. She didn't need to be told twice. Whatever was out there, it wasn't friendly. She spun around, her breath caught in her throat. The hallway stretched out before her, dark and oppressive. The growl came again, followed by a loud scraping noise, like something dragging along the floor. She couldn't risk staying in the open. Her heart pounded as she darted toward a nearby storage room, throwing the door open and slipping inside. She slammed the door behind her, breathing heavily as she pressed her back to the cool metal wall. The growl was growing louder, closer. Lyra's pulse raced, and for a moment, she could feel the blood rush to her ears. She had to calm down. Panicking wouldn't help her now. She strained her ears, listening for any further sounds. Footsteps. Scraping. The creature was moving. It was coming for her. She grabbed a metal rod from the storage room shelf, her hands tightening around it. It was a simple weapon, but it would have to do. Lyra forced herself to take slow, controlled breaths. She was going to fight her way out of this if it came to that. The sound grew nearer. She pressed herself against the wall, trying to make herself as small as possible, her back to the cold surface. Her eyes scanned the room for anything else that might help. There were crates stacked in the corner, some of them containing basic supplies. Food rations, medical kits, nothing that could be used as a weapon, but perhaps something to hide behind. The growling was deafening now. It was no longer a whisper in the distance. It was right outside the door. Lyra's hand tightened around the metal rod. She had no choice. She had to make a stand. Then, the door to the storage room rattled. It shook violently, the sound of claws scraping against metal sending chills down her spine. She instinctively jumped back, her eyes wide with terror. The growl became a snarl, a deep primal sound that vibrated through the room. Something huge was on the other side of the door. Lyra's thoughts raced. She had to do something. She had to stop it before it came in. The door creaked as something massive slammed into it from the other side. Lyra's breath hitched and she braced herself for the impact. But the door held. For now. Suddenly, the growling stopped. The silence that followed was even worse than the noise had been. It was oppressive. And then, Lyra heard something she hadn't expected. A voice. "It knows you're here." Lyra's heart skipped a beat. The voice wasn't the growl of the creature. It was a low, human voice. She turned toward the corner of the storage room, her eyes scanning the shadows. "Who's there?" She called out, her voice shaking. "Show yourself." A figure stepped out of the darkness, tall, clad in dark, torn clothing, with a strange device strapped to his arm. His face was hidden in the shadows, but his eyes glowed with an eerie intensity. "It's not just the Deathworlders you have to worry about," the figure said, his voice low and calm. "There's something worse in this base, something that's been waiting." Lyra's pulse raced. Her mind raced faster, processing the words. "What are you talking about? Who are you? And how do you know what's happening?" The figure stepped closer, and his face finally came into the light. His features were sharp, his expression unreadable. "You've unleashed something that shouldn't have been touched. The Deathworlders. They're just the beginning. What's coming is far worse." Lyra felt a cold dread settle over her. She had thought the creature she'd encountered was the worst of it, but now she wasn't so sure. "Tell me what it is," Lyra demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me everything." The figure hesitated, his eyes darkening. "You won't believe it. No one ever does. But you have to understand, the galaxy has never faced anything like this." The growl returned, louder this time, shaking the room. Lyra's heart stopped. It was close. Too close. "Get ready," the figure said, his tone grim. "The real terror is about to begin." Lyra took a deep breath, gripping the metal rod tighter. Whatever was coming next, she knew one thing for sure. She would have to fight to survive. The growl reverberated through the walls of the storage room, sending a shiver down Lyra's spine. She could hear the footsteps now, heavy, purposeful, dragging against the metal floors, getting closer with each passing second. Her pulse raced, her grip tightening around the makeshift weapon in her hands. She had no idea what was out there, but she could feel the presence looming, a threat so tangible it was suffocating. The figure in the shadows remained silent, his eyes locked onto the door as if he, too, was preparing for the inevitable confrontation. His face was hard, cold, unreadable, but there was a sense of urgency in his movements that didn't escape Lyra's notice. He was preparing for something big, something that he knew would come for them both. The door trembled again. The creature outside slammed against it, its growl becoming a snarl of frustration, as if it could sense the fear lingering in the room. Lyra's breath hitched. The figure moved with surprising speed, crossing the room to stand near her. "Don't make a sound," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "If you want to survive, you need to stay quiet. It's hunting us, and it's smarter than you think." Lyra didn't question him. She didn't have time. She nodded, her heart pounding in her chest, every nerve on edge. The sound of scratching, dragging claws filled the air again, louder this time, scraping against the metal door. The creature outside was growing restless, its patience wearing thin. The figure moved again, this time toward a small vent on the wall, his fingers working quickly. He glanced back at Lyra, his expression firm. When I open this, we need to move fast. It won't take long before it breaks through. Lyra's mind was spinning. Her thoughts raced as she tried to process everything. The creature, the prison, the mysterious figure, and now this strange warning. The galaxy, she realized, was far darker than she had ever imagined. But she didn't have the luxury of contemplating it. She had to survive. The vent opened with a quiet hiss, and the figure crawled through, motioning for Lyra to follow. Her legs moved before her mind could catch up. She shoved her flashlight into her pocket and squeezed through the opening after him, her body contorting awkwardly in a cramped space. The air in the vent was cold, dank, and smelled faintly of decay. Lyra's stomach churned, but she pushed forward, determined to escape whatever horrors awaited her. As she crawled, she could hear the growl growing louder, closer. The creature was not far behind. The figure ahead of her moved quickly, his hand steady and sure. Lyra tried to keep up, but the tight space and her growing sense of panic made it difficult. Every sound she made seemed to echo through the dark metal tunnel. She could feel the creature's presence just outside the vent, as though it was waiting for them to make a mistake. A sharp noise erupted from behind them, the sound of claws scratching at the metal. It was right there. Lyra's heart skipped a beat. The figure ahead of her stopped abruptly, turning his head to face her, his eyes wide with urgency. "Keep moving," he hissed. "We don't have much time." She nodded, pushing herself forward again, the sound of the creature's growl still echoing in her ears. It wasn't just close. It was getting closer. Lyra felt a sharp prick of fear in her chest, and she forced herself to ignore it. She couldn't let it control her. Not now. They reached a junction in the vent, a wide opening that led to another part of the base. The figure stopped once again, peering into the darkness beyond. His eyes scanned the area quickly before he turned back to Lyra. "This way," he murmured. "Stay close. We need to move fast." They crawled out of the vent into a corridor that seemed eerily quiet. The air was thick with tension, as if the base itself was holding its breath. Lyra followed the figure down the dark hall, every step deliberate, every sound amplified in the silence. Her body was on edge, her senses heightened, her instincts screaming at her to be careful. She glanced at the figure as he led her through the labyrinth of corridors, his every movement precise, calculated. There was something about him, something familiar, though she couldn't place it. His eyes, dark and focused, seemed to hold an understanding of the terror that was unfolding, as though he had seen this before. "What is it?" Lyra whispered, keeping her voice low. "What's hunting us? What's inside this base?" The figure didn't answer right away. He glanced back at her, his expression hardening. "You won't believe it," he said after a long pause. "But I'll tell you anyway. It's not just a creature. It's something worse. A force that feeds on fear, on chaos. It was sealed away for a reason." A chill ran down Lyra's spine. She had heard stories, whispers in the corners of the galaxy about things older than time itself, beings that thrived on destruction and fear. But she had never imagined she'd be caught in the middle of it. "Why is it here? Why now?" Lyra asked, her voice trembling slightly. The figure hesitated again, his face shadowed. "The base was a containment facility. We were holding something much worse than any Deathworlder. When you broke the seal, you triggered the awakening. And now it's coming for everything." Lyra's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the weight of his words, the gravity of what he was saying. But before she could respond, the ground beneath their feet trembled, and a deafening roar erupted from somewhere deep within the base. The walls shook violently, and lights flickered overhead. The sound of the creature's growl filled the air, followed by another loud crash, like metal being torn apart. Something was coming. Something massive. Lyra's heart thudded in her chest as her instincts screamed at her to run. The figure's eyes widened. "It's here," he said, his voice low. "And there's no escape now." Before Lyra could react, the ground shook again, and a wave of pressure slammed into her chest, knocking her off her feet. The walls groaned under the strain, and dust fell from the ceiling. She tried to stand, but the force of the shockwave sent her sprawling. Something was emerging, something that had been locked away for too long, and it was coming for them. The figure stood, his face grim. He extended his hand to her, pulling her up. "Come on," he said, urgency lacing his voice. "We're running out of time." Together, they sprinted down the darkened hall, the growls of the creature echoing behind them, and the realization setting in. The nightmare had only just begun. The growl reverberated through the walls of the storage room, sending a shiver down Lyra's spine. She could hear the footsteps now, heavy, purposeful, dragging against the metal floors, getting closer with each passing second. Her pulse raced, her grip tightening around the makeshift weapon in her hands. She had no idea what was out there, but she could feel the presence looming, a threat so tangible it was suffocating. The figure in the shadows remained silent, his eyes locked onto the door as if he, too, was preparing for the inevitable confrontation. His face was hard, cold, unreadable, but there was a sense of urgency in his movements that didn't escape Lyra's notice. He was preparing for something. Something big, something that he knew would come for them both. The door trembled again. The creature outside slammed against it, its growl becoming a snarl of frustration, as if it could sense the fear lingering in the room. Lyra's breath hitched. The figure moved with surprising speed, crossing the room to stand near her. "Don't make a sound," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "If you want to survive, you need to stay quiet. It's hunting us, and it's smarter than you think." Lyra didn't question him. She didn't have time. She nodded, her heart pounding in her chest, every nerve on edge. The sound of scratching, dragging claws filled the air again, louder this time, scraping against the metal door. The creature outside was growing restless, its patience wearing thin. The figure moved again, this time toward a small vent on the wall, his fingers working quickly. He glanced back at Lyra, his expression firm. "When I open this, we need to move fast. It won't take long before it breaks through." Lyra's mind was spinning. Her thoughts raced as she tried to process everything. The creature, the prison, the mysterious figure, and now this strange warning. The galaxy, she realized, was far darker than she had ever imagined. But she didn't have the luxury of contemplating it. She had to survive. The vent opened with a quiet hiss, and the figure crawled through, motioning for Lyra to follow. Her legs moved before her mind could catch up. She shoved her flashlight into her pocket and squeezed through the opening after him, her body contorting awkwardly in the cramped space. The air in the vent was cold, dank, and smelled faintly of decay. Lyra's stomach churned, but she pushed forward, determined to escape whatever horrors awaited her. As she crawled, she could hear the growl growing louder, closer. The creature was not far behind. The figure ahead of her moved quickly, his hand steady and sure. Lyra tried to keep up, but the tight space and her growing sense of panic made it difficult. Every sound she made seemed to echo through the dark metal tunnel. She could feel the creature's presence just outside the vent, as though it was waiting for them to make a mistake. A sharp noise erupted from behind them, the sound of claws scratching at the metal. It was right there. Lyra's heart skipped a beat. The figure ahead of her stopped abruptly, turning his head to face her, his eyes wide with urgency. "Keep moving," he hissed. "We don't have much time." She nodded, pushing herself forward again, the sound of the creature's growl still echoing in her ears. It wasn't just close, it was getting closer. Lyra felt a sharp prick of fear in her chest, and she forced herself to ignore it. She couldn't let it control her. Not now. They reached a junction in the vent, a wide opening that led to another part of the base. The figure stopped once again, peering into the darkness beyond. His eyes scanned the area quickly before he turned back to Lyra. "This way," he murmured. "Stay close. We need to move fast." They crawled out of the vent, into a corridor that seemed eerily quiet. The air was thick with tension, as if the base itself was holding its breath. Lyra followed the figure down the dark hall, every step deliberate, every sound amplified in the silence. Her body was on edge, her senses heightened, her instincts screaming at her to be careful. She glanced at the figure as he led her through the labyrinth of corridors, his every movement precise, calculated. There was something about him, something familiar, though she couldn't place it. His eyes, dark and focused, seemed to hold an understanding of the terror that was unfolding, as though he had seen this before. "What is it?" Lyra whispered, keeping her voice low. "What's hunting us? What's inside this base?" The figure didn't answer right away. He glanced back at her, his expression hardening. "You won't believe it," he said after a long pause. "But I'll tell you anyway. It's not just a creature. It's something worse. A force that feeds on fear, on chaos. It was sealed away for a reason." A chill ran down Lyra's spine. She had heard stories, whispers in the corners of the galaxy about things older than time itself, beings that thrived on destruction and fear. But she had never imagined she'd be caught in the middle of it. "Why is it here? Why now?" Lyra asked, her voice trembling slightly. The figure hesitated again, his face shadowed. The base was a containment facility. "We were holding something much worse than any Deathworlder. When you broke the seal, you triggered the awakening. And now it's coming for everything." Lyra's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the weight of his words, the gravity of what he was saying. But before she could respond, the ground beneath their feet trembled, and a deafening roar erupted from somewhere deep within the base. The walls shook violently, and lights flickered overhead. The sound of the creature's growl filled the air, followed by another loud crash, like metal being torn apart. Something was coming. Something massive. Lyra's heart thudded in her chest as her instincts screamed at her to run. The figure's eyes widened. "It's here," he said, his voice low. "And there's no escape now." Before Lyra could react, the ground shook again, and a wave of pressure slammed into her chest, knocking her off her feet. The walls groaned under the strain, and dust fell from the ceiling. She tried to stand, but the force of the shockwave sent her sprawling. Something was emerging, something that had been locked away for too long, and it was coming for them. The figure stood, his face grim. He extended his hand to her, pulling her up. "Come on," he said, urgency lacing his voice. "We're running out of time." Together, they sprinted down the darkened hall, the growls of the creature echoing behind them, and the realization setting in. The nightmare had only just begun. The silence was unbearable. Lyra's every sense was heightened as she crouched behind the crates, trying not to even breathe too loudly. Her mind raced, her thoughts a blur of fear and adrenaline. The figure beside her was calm, his gaze fixed on the corridor ahead, but his jaw was clenched tightly, his body coiled in preparation. The sound of the creature's growl had faded slightly, but it hadn't gone away. It was out there, somewhere in the shadows, stalking them. Lyra's heart hammered in her chest. She could feel the air around her thick with tension, as though even the walls of the base were holding their breath. Every slight noise, every creak of the floor or flicker of the emergency lights made her jump. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, hunted like prey. "Stay low," the figure muttered, breaking the silence in a tone so quiet it was barely audible. "When I move, follow me. Don't make a sound." Lyra nodded, her breath shallow and uneven. Her eyes flicked between the figure's tense form and the darkness in the corridor ahead. She had to trust him, even though everything in her screamed to run in the opposite direction. But there was no way out now. They were trapped. Suddenly, there was a scraping sound from the hallway. Metal on metal. It was unmistakable. Lyra felt her stomach lurch. It was coming closer. The figure's head snapped to the side, his sharp eyes narrowing. "Now," he hissed. Without thinking, Lyra followed, crouching low and moving swiftly behind him. Her heart pounded in her ears as they dashed through the hallway, barely making a sound. They rounded a corner, and for a brief moment, Lyra dared to hope that they had evaded the creature. But then, a sharp, bone-chilling shriek echoed from the corridor behind them. The creature had found them. Lyra's blood ran cold. She didn't dare look back. Her legs were burning, but she pushed them harder, faster. The figure led her through another hallway, his pace steady, but Lyra could feel the weight of the creature's pursuit growing closer with each passing second. They turned another corner and skidded to a halt before a large reinforced door. The figure wasted no time, pulling out a small device from his pocket and quickly scanning it over the door's control panel. Lyra could hear the heavy footsteps behind them, each one reverberating through the halls like a death knell. The figure's face was etched with frustration. "Come on, come on." A loud crash echoed from behind them, followed by the deafening sound of claws scraping against the walls. The creature was right there. Lyra's pulse quickened, and she almost lost control, the panic threatening to overwhelm her. But she forced herself to stay still, to trust that the figure would get them out in time. The door clicked, and a hiss of air escaped as it slid open. The figure grabbed Lyra by the arm and yanked her inside. They were in, but they weren't safe yet. The door slammed shut behind them with a deafening clang, and Lyra heard the creature's roar, furious and primal, just on the other side. She collapsed to her knees, gasping for air, her mind spinning with the reality of what they had just escaped. But as she tried to catch her breath, she realized something else. They weren't alone in the room. The control room was dimly lit, filled with consoles and monitors, but it wasn't empty. There were people there, strangers, their faces a mix of fear and uncertainty. Some were huddled together, whispering, while others were frantically typing commands into the consoles. At the far side of the room, there was a large reinforced glass window that overlooked the base's interior, and Lyra could see the darkness beyond, the flickering lights casting long shadows. "Who are they?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved to one of the consoles, his fingers flying over the keys. Lyra followed him, her eyes scanning the room nervously. "They're survivors," he said shortly. "People who were caught in the initial breach. We've been trying to hold the lockdown, but..." He trailed off, his expression darkening. Lyra turned to look out the window, her eyes narrowing as she saw the chaos unfolding below. There was no denying it now. The base was under siege. "They've breached the outer perimeter," the figure said, his voice low and tense. "And now the creatures are flooding the halls. We don't have much time before they reach here." "Then what do we do?" Lyra asked, her voice tight with fear. "We activate the full lockdown," he said firmly. "The control room is the last line of defense. If we can seal this place off, we might be able to contain them. But it's risky. The creatures are adapting, and once they breach the inner defenses, there's no turning back." The air in the control room grew thick with tension as Lyra looked at the monitors, trying to make sense of the chaos. There was a flashing red alert on the screen in front of her. "Containment breach," it read. "Failure in lockdown procedures." She felt a chill settle in her chest. The creatures weren't just attacking the base. They were actively sabotaging the defense systems. They had figured out how to break through. "Can you fix it?" Lyra asked, desperation creeping into her voice. "Please, you have to fix it." The figure looked at her, his expression hard but resolute. "I'll try. But if this doesn't work, there's one last option. A failsafe." Lyra felt her stomach drop. "What's the failsafe?" The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned back to the console, his fingers flying over the keys. "We'll activate it when the time comes," he said, his voice low and steady. "If we don't have a choice, it's the only way to stop them." Lyra nodded, her mind racing with questions. She didn't understand fully, but she didn't have time to ask more. The sounds of the creatures outside were growing louder, more frantic. The weight of the situation was closing in on her like a suffocating blanket. And then the power flickered. The room was plunged into darkness for a heartbeat. Then the lights came back on, and Lyra froze. In the distance, she saw something moving outside the window. A shadow, a figure, a massive, unholy thing that was far more terrifying than anything she had imagined. The creature was inside, and there was no escape. "Prepare yourselves," the figure said quietly, his eyes narrowing as he turned to face Lyra. "It's going to be a long night." The hunt had just begun.